evening. Let me do that before I forget. Okay, welcome everybody. My name's Rebecca Wakeford and I am your lecturer for this first semester that you have in psychology. I'm very excited to meet you all and to get the semester underway. Firstly, I don't know if anybody's got any questions that are burning issues that you need to raise. You are welcome at any time to pop them into this chat or to raise your hand. We will have time at the end, I hope, for some questions. I did send you an overview of the module and everything that's required. So if anything's not clear, please just feel free to ask me. I did give you my email address in those slides, and you are welcome to email me at any time. I will respond usually within 24 hours. If it's over a weekend, maybe a little longer. But I do check my emails from you guys every day. If you do email me, if you've got any burning issues or questions or concerns, please just put your module code in the chat, because I have a number of groups and I just need to know that I'm answering you on the correct content, that I haven't got you confused with one of my other groups. So that's just a little bit of guideline when you come to email me. And also on your VC Learn, there's also a little button you can click that will message me directly. So at the end of this module, I'll just go through the ICE tasks and how they work, so you're clear about that, because that's really our starting point. When it comes to engaging with the content, we don't need to stress too much about assignments right now. I have put all of your dates up on the calendar for you, which will show you when your Collaborate sessions are. There's due dates for ICE tasks. Your assignment dates are on there, as well as the exam date in November. So a lot to work towards. So any burning issues, welcome to put them in the chat, or we can deal with them at the end. Let me show you first how the module, the learner guide works, and then you can see from there how much information we need to take from our textbooks, Nadia. It is a big textbook that's covered, that's for this semester, and when you carry over to 2025 to the next semester, there are some chapters we don't cover, and there's certain learning outcomes we need to achieve. So I think it will become clear as we work. Don't panic now about the size of the textbook. I think you'll find your way around it quite easily. Okay. All right, so without further ado, we're going to start on our first learning unit. You've got content for this on your VC Learn platform, but the way I structure my content when I give it to you is I use the textbook as my source and my guide for you, as well as the learning outcomes. Okay, so you can work through the material on VC Learn, but the majority of work is going to come straight out of your textbook. So that should be your guiding resource until we need additional research that we have to do when it comes to assignments, but we're not even going to stress about that right now. Okay, so our very first learning unit is really just a bit of a top-down approach on the discipline of psychology, how it started, and some of our core theorists that really underpin it. Psychology is a huge discipline. Hence the textbook being so thick, and you'll also find all the chapters are very, very different. So we move this year and next year when you do the second semester, sometimes you might feel like it's a little bit like a life science lesson, because there's some chapters that we really unpack the biology of behavior. There's some statistical and research chapters. There's chapters on mental health. There's chapters on our own health, on stress. So it goes all over the place. But it really is giving you a core understanding of the many facets that make up this discipline. So we start really with a big high-level view. And as you progress through the different years, if you're planning on continuing with psychology, you dig into that in more detail. But in first year, what we're trying to do is try to give you exposure to all of those different components from a high-level perspective, with a focus in where we need to a little bit deeper, but issues are sort of get more complex as you move through the different years. Okay, So our learning unit 1 is really just a high-level approach of what the discipline of psychology is about and some of the key things that underpin the discipline. So in your module outline, and this is where you need to pay attention when it comes to your textbook and also when it comes to our exams. So when you're given your module outline, you're given an overall sort of ideas what we're trying to achieve in the first year of psychology, but it's broken down into a number of learning units. Okay, so in our first semester, I think we've got 6 learning units. So the first one is this one on the evolution of psychology. But every learning unit is broken down into what they call learning outcomes. So within this first learning unit that we're going to do tonight, there's a number of outcomes. So when it gets to the end of it and when you've finished working through the content, you can basically check off that you are clear that you've achieved those learning outcomes. So this is where I always say use this as a guide, okay, because there's keywords in these learning outcomes that when it comes to examinations, this is what forms the basis of your assignments and your exams. So each learning unit is broken down into themes, and the themes have got different learning outcomes. So, for example, our first learning outcome is we need to be able to provide a comprehensive definition of psychology, which hopefully by the end of the session and by the time you've finished working through the content, you will be able to do that. So you can tick a box, okay? You need to be able to provide a brief description of how psychology developed through the ages. You need to explain the contributions of some of the major early theorists, but remember this is just a high-level approach. We don't need to have too much detail right now at this point. Be able to discuss how psychology developed in South Africa. Provide an overview of the 6 theoretical perspectives, which we will cover tonight, and be able to discuss African psychology and some of the inclusion and transformation challenges. So each one of those outcomes is quite specific. So, you know, when it comes to learning outcome 3, it says briefly explain the contribution. So it's telling you it's more of a high-level overview. Provide an overview of the 6 contemporary theoretical perspectives. So use these learning outcomes to guide you when it comes to the end of the learning unit, and make sure that you're clear that you've got enough information at your disposal to meet those learning outcomes. Okay, so in your textbook, in each chapter of the textbook at the end, there's quite a big section on an overview. There's some critical applications, there's some personal reflections. So some of that chapter is made up of different material, but you, for the purpose of this, you need to focus in on the content as per your learning outcomes. Does that make your textbook a little bit less daunting for you? Okay, so let's just start as to why you should be studying this. Some of you are here because you want to pursue a career in psychology. Some of you are here because it's a module that you have to do as part of something else. But there's many reasons to study psychology, okay? And by studying psychology, it helps you really understand mental processes and behaviors. And it helps us understand often why we behave and act and think the way we do, but it also gives us insight into other people's behaviors. Okay, so we learn about different things. We learn about personality, how personality affects how we think and we feel. That helps us empathize. We learn about development. We learn about human development from children through to adulthood. So all of that knowledge that we're learning in this module will allow us to get better understanding of ourselves as well as the world around us. So it's not just about expanding on moving into this field as a psychologist, if that's what you wish to do, but hopefully it gives you a better perspective on yourself as well as other people around you. Okay, so there's lots of interest in studying psychology. It also helps us think, okay? So part of psychology is being able to think critically about things, being able to solve problems and analyze and develop new ideas through reflecting on what's happened in the past, what behaviors are taking place. And you start to see things from different perspectives. So there's not just always one truth about how things work. So it helps us really unpack things and understand things better. And ultimately, it has a positive impact. We can hopefully, with the little bit that we do learn, even in the first semester, we might be able to reach out and understand somebody a bit better and understand the way people behave in certain situations. So it's a great subject to study, and I hope you enjoy it. Okay. If at any time my internet connection goes or I break up, please just pop a message in the chat. I've got a number of connections and sometimes something drops somewhere because that's just what technology does. Right, so let's get into psychology. So psychology is a branch of what we call the social sciences. Okay, so you have got maths and chemistry and those physical kinds of sciences. This is a social science. And ultimately what psychology does, it's a study of the mind and behavior. So the role of a psychologist is to study brain functions, to study mental processes, as well as behavior patterns, to better understand the way in which humans think and develop. So there's some critical things here that we look at. We look at how the brain works, different mental processes, but ultimately behavior. Okay, and psychology helps us get a better understanding of those things in order to understand why people behave in a certain way. So the word psychology as a discipline, okay, is very recent, okay? But the history of when psychology started goes all the way back to those early philosophers, which is why the word psychology comes from two different Greek words. It comes from the word psyche, which means soul, okay, and it comes from the word logos, which means the study of a subject. So it's really the bringing together of philosophical questioning, added to that scientific reasoning, and we'll go into why we add scientific reasoning. And those two things sort of came together. They merged together to form the discipline of psychology. But psychology is never static. It changes all the time. And over time, the definition has also changed about what psychology means. And you'll see that where we unpack some of the history and some of the perspectives and the theorists, that there's been different perspectives to psychology. Some perspectives sometimes have overruled others. Some perspectives have faded away and others have come to the fore. So it's really very it evolves all of the time. The research knowledge that we have just grows and grows and grows and grows exponentially. And so continuously the discipline is being added to. But in general, it's about understanding all the things that we do. That's a very broad term. So ultimately, it's about studying the whys and the hows of human behavior, which gives us a very powerful way of thinking when we start to understand why and how people behave in certain ways. So ultimately, the history goes way, 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 way back to those early days of Plato and Aristotle, when people started to sort of question things philosophically. But as science has been added to the discipline and it's become more empirical, so it's gained more structure to it as a discipline. So although we say psychology is a social science, it's really critical to remember that whatever happens in psychology, and this is where the discipline changed back at the beginning of the 20th century, it is a scientific study, that ultimately any research that anybody puts forward in psychology has to be proven. It has to be verifiable. Psychology is not somebody's subjective opinion. The discipline evolves through scientific studies. Okay, so when you start to look at some of your assignments and we dig into understanding how certain things come to be, most of it, in fact, all of it now it's based on research, on verifiable research, where somebody thinks something, establishes a research question, does the research, investigates, and it comes to a conclusion, and that needs to be able to be replicable by somebody else. And our second module will give us more insight into that. But for now, you have to really understand that it's a scientific study of the mind, of the mental processes that go on in the mind, as well as behavior. So when we say it's a science, that means that the method in which we construct it is based around investigation. Okay, So it's not about who does the investigation, it's about the processes that we use to do the investigation. So it's empirical, which means it has to be measurable, and whatever measurements are given has to be precise. So almost like conducting a science experiment or a chemistry experiment, adding things together, seeing what the outcomes are, reflecting on the results, sharing the results. The same process happens in psychology. So we say that it's a systematic method, which means we have to work through processes of identifying things, analyzing things, and describing things. But ultimately, that gives us key insight into the mind, mental processes, and behavior of people. So from this point, it's just critical to understand that psychology is a scientific study. Okay, the way it's approached is done in a scientific and sound way. So the goal of psychology, when we look at it from that perspective, we have got really 4 main goals. Is that we need to be able to describe something that happens. Okay, we need to explain and understand why that has happened, why that particular behavior might have happened. We can use that to predict, if we think about it in a term of a behavior, predict what might happen thereafter, and allow us the opportunity to modify, okay, so that the behavior can be changed. So our main goals is to describe, explain, to be able to predict, which is what research does. It allows us to predict certain things, and then to work around modifying. So those are the major goals. So when we look at psychology and we look at the core components of psychology, and this came back from our definition, it's really about the study of 3 things. It's about the study of the mind, it's about the study of mental processes, and it's about the study of behavior. So when we think about the mind is different to the brain. The brain that sits inside our skull, okay, is the hardware. Okay, it's got different parts to it, neurons, neural networks, and we'll learn about that. But the mind is something quite abstract that sits in the brain, and it fosters our consciousness. Okay, and it produces those mental processes of thoughts, memories, and perceptions. So it's not really an observable thing. We can't cut someone's brain open and see the mind. But it's those things that happen in the brain, those neural pathways that create these thoughts and memories and perceptions. So it allows us, what happens in the mind is we can apply complex kind of networking skills in those parts of the brain to form associations and to really interpret new things that are happening. And it very much uses what we already know that's stored, okay, but it also draws in from new things that we're learning all the time. So that's what the mind is, okay. The mental processes that we also study, okay, are those activities that happen in the brain that allow us to produce actions and changes and things like that, where our mind is working towards some kind of outcome, some kind of resolution. So the processes themselves that are produced in the mind are things like thoughts and memories and perceptions, learning and reasoning. And a disruption or a disorder, whether it's a behavioral disorder or a cognitive disorder, is really caused by some kind of misfunctioning in our mental processes. And the behavior, when we talk about behavior in psychology, behavior is observable. It's any action or response that's carried out, okay, that can be seen. So it's the outcome of a mental process. So we have our mind. Inside our mind, these mental processes take place: thinking, perception, reasoning, whatever it might be. But the ultimate outcome of those mental processes is a behavior, which is a response to something. Everything we do is in response to something. Okay, it's like a reaction pattern to something. We respond to a stimulus in our environment. If we see someone moving towards us in a threatening way, you know, we have a behavioral response that happens within our body. So it's how we respond to certain situations and certain stimuli. So ultimately, when we look at psychology, we're looking around the concept of the mind, we're looking around the concept of mental processes, and we're looking around the concept of behavior. But this will all become clearer as we move through our different learning units. Okay, any questions? Are you all good? Please just shout if you're not. So this little mind map, and you don't need to see it in detail, okay, but I really put it up there so that you can get a good idea. These are some of the key sort of features that have happened over the last 100 or so years or 200 years within the discipline, and it can just show you how all interlinked things are. One thing can lead to something else. So the branch of psychology has grown and grown and grown and grown, and things draw on each other. Theorists take leads from each other. Theories move away. Other sort of ways of thinking become more prevalent. So it's just an idea as how psychology has really grown over time, okay, and how it comprises so many different components. So let's unpack now a little bit around some of these key stages in the historical development of psychology. So we said that psychology is a scientific discipline, but at what point did it move into becoming a scientific discipline? And it really started with a gentleman called Wilhelm Wundt. And he was really called or nicknamed the father of modern psychology, because he was the first person really to bring in the concept of experimentation and research, and he established the first formal laboratory, and this was in Germany in 1879. Okay, so he developed psychology as a science. This is where it got its sort of title, that it is becoming a scientific discipline. And his focus at that point in those early days was very much a focus on consciousness. And consciousness is what we sort of think about, what is in our consciousness all the time. It's an awareness of what's happening in our surrounds. It's about that immediate experience. So he started to do some scientific studies around conscious awareness, and his studies focused on things like attention, memory, sensory processing, and reaction times to things. So it was very simple, okay, but his focus really was on those things that around what we are experiencing at that particular time, okay, and it really was dealing with the fastest, simplest kind of reaction times to something. But he was known as the founder of this branch of psychology as a scientific discipline. Also around this time, two schools of thought were developed around psychology. We had the school that sort of called themselves structuralists, and we had the school that called themselves functionalists. And as two schools, these have fallen away now. They've been replaced with different perspectives. But some of these components do come through into some of our more recent theorists and theories. So what is structuralism? Structuralism, think about it like a structure, like building blocks. It's where the mind is broken down into its smallest possible elements. Okay, that's what structuralists try to do. They try to deconstruct something into tiny little elements and see how they all fit together like building blocks. So the founder, or the first person to really come to the fore in structuralism, was a gentleman called Edward Titchener, who studied under Wundt. And what he tried to do was try to analyze consciousness. So instead of taking consciousness as a concept, he tried to unpack it and break it down into its building blocks and see how they were related. So if you unpack consciousness, what's in your consciousness now is things like sensations and feelings and images. He tried to break those up and try to understand how consciousness was structured. And how he did this was he used a process of introspection, where you kind of look inside yourself and try to observe and talk about your own experiences. That's what the process of introspection means. And we'll see this later on again. It was the way Freud worked was with introspection. So he was trying to analyze the experiences that people were having through introspection to try and determine what those basic building blocks were. And then came along the functionalists who said it's not really necessary to break things down into their component parts. Really, what the functionists were doing was really looking at, we're not interested in how consciousness is made up, but what is the function of consciousness? What is its purpose? We don't want to know those building blocks. We want to know what it is and what its purpose is. So this was William James. And a lot of his work drew from Darwin's theories around evolution, and that basically any behavior or anything that happens is because it's about survival and reproduction. But he came to the point, one of his key sort of findings or guiding principles was that consciousness consists of a continual flow of thoughts. It's not static, like structuralists possibly suggest by looking at its building blocks. It's like consciousness is always moving. It's a stream. It's always a continual flow of sensations and images and perceptions and whatever is happening around us. So he moved away from what was then a laboratory based approach to really looking at how people adapt and behave in the real world, and very much focus around behavior has a purpose, it has a reason. And the value we place on that behavior depends very much on its outcomes, which really led into a behavioral perspective later on. But we had these two opposing different schools of thoughts that sort of worked against each other. But subsequently, both of them sort of fell away and have been replaced with more significant perspectives. Okay, so you just need to understand that that's part of the historical growth. So what are these perspectives that we're talking about? The first perspective that gained prevalence was called the psychoanalytical perspective. And this was early in the 20th century. And the main proponent of this perspective, and you probably have all heard about Sigmund Freud, okay? And we'll learn more about Freud in later chapters. So like this is just an overview. So the psychoanalytical perspective, Freud was a key proponent, but also Carl Jung was a proponent of this perspective, and very much based around the key thing, especially with Freud, that the way we behave, the mental disorders we might experience have unconscious motives, and they're based on what happened to us in early childhood. That's their key sort of philosophy or key guide, okay? Very much based on what is happening in our unconscious that we're not actually aware of, but it's coming to the surface as something negative, like a negative behavior or an anxiety attack. So how did Sigmund Freud get to this, and how did he treat people? So this is where the tool psychoanalysis comes along. Okay, you probably have also all heard the word psychoanalysis. This is where it started. And it's a process that Freud used to treat people with psychological problems. So if people were experiencing irrational fears, obsessions, and anxieties, he used the tool of psychoanalysis. That was his process. And he used this ability to, or to try to get people to introspect, to really uncover what is in their unconscious that is causing these problems and bring them to the level of conscious awareness. Okay, so all of those things that might have happened to us that we have repressed or hidden down, his process was to get them to come out, and then people would be able to deal with these issues. But ultimately what he was saying is that people are not masters of their own minds, okay, because all of this sits in your unconscious experiences. You have repressed it all. It's as a result of what happened in early childhood. Therefore, because it's like that, you don't have any control over it, okay? People aren't masters of their mind. Very much based around, and remember this is back in the earlier 20th century, so it became very controversial. There was an emphasis on It's not really a scandal about sex, okay? It's more a theoretical perspective about sex and behavior from infancy, and we'll unpack that when we unpack Freud and in child development. We'll see that, but his theory had a focus on sex, on sexual urges, on the control of those sexual urges, repressed sexual urges, and it was those that really drove these disorders. So there was quite a lot of focus around sexual expression in various ways, which did make it controversial, especially back in those days. Okay, there's a lot of arguments against psychoanalysis now because it doesn't really account for any kind of spiritual impact. It doesn't really account for our environmental impacts. It doesn't account for culture. It's very focused on those repressed urges. And when he did his research, it wasn't scientific, okay? He used individual case studies. He got them to introspect, and he also did the same thing on himself. So nothing he really did was replicable from a scientific perspective, but it still held a lot of credibility at the time, although it did raise controversy, and other proponents of other theories sort of came in and started to take the place of what Freud was discussing. So a saying there at the bottom is unexpressed emotions will never die. They're buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. And that's really what it was. Letitia, how would spiritual culture and influences changed what he was saying? Well, he didn't look at the context in which people found themselves in. And you'll see as we look at this, the environment that we are in has a significant impact on our behavior. And Freud never acknowledged that in any of his theories. It was very much based on the individual and these repressed urges. And you'll see as we move through some of these different theorists, you'll see how ideas have expanded to become more cognizant of the environment in which we find ourselves in, whether it's spiritual, cultural, socioeconomic, whatever it might be. They all have an impact on our behavior ultimately. But with Freud, it didn't. Penelope, have you got a question?
Hi.
Hi.
So I just wanted to ask, with regards to describing or kind of going through psychology's history, how do we like approach it? Do we say, okay, and it started off with this, and then a school was opened in Germany, and then after that there was structuralism and functionalism, and this was then.
That's right. You just sort of have a timeline of how the discipline evolved. You'll see it by the time we finish. You will be able to put that it comes from those philosophical backgrounds, and that it developed through the process, exactly like I'm trying to lay it out for you now, will really be what will guide you.
And up to which point should we speak about psychology's history? Is it all the way up to humanists, or do we go beyond?
Let me get to the end. Let me get to the end, and you'll probably see it a lot more clearer.
Okay,
is that
thank
okay?
you. Yeah,
and
no
we
problem.
can revisit it at the end if you're not fine.
Okay.
All right. So we had Freud and psychoanalysis, and Jung came into that picture as well. Then the next major perspective was a very different shift from the way that Freud approached things with psychoanalysis. Is now we have the behaviorists coming to the fore. Different kind of approach to understanding behavior. Okay. Really, their significance was big push between 1913 and 1920. But their key understanding, and this is where when we think about the scientific discipline, only observable events can be studied scientifically. So what Freud was saying, like I said to you with introspection, there's nothing there that's empirical. So our behaviorists came forward and they said we can only study what we can see, what can be verified. But their key thing was, and remember with psychology, we're trying to understand behavior. Their key approach was that behaviors are learned. Okay, whereas Freud said your behavior is due to some kind of repressed sexual urge or something that's happened to you, and it's coming out to your conscious awareness as a maladaptive behavior. The behaviorists themselves said those behaviors that are being experienced have to be learned. Okay, they weren't interested in what had happened, as repressed sexual urges. So this is the behaviorist. So clear that psychology should be seen as a science and that theories need to be supported by empirical data. So behaviorism is primarily concerned with observable behaviors as opposed to internal events like thinking and emotion. Okay, so it's those external behaviors. What you see is what has to be scientifically measured. So back in those days, and you'll see as we look through some of these significant contributors to this perspective, you can't put humans in a laboratory. So a lot of the work that behaviorists did used animals, okay, to come to their conclusions. And we look at some significant contributors here to this discipline. The first one is John B. Watson, who was really considered the founder of behaviorism and proposed the fact that scientific and observable measures are critical. Therefore, consciousness and mental processes are not scientifically measurable. Therefore, they don't fit into the discipline. So that was his stand. He was sort of key when we talk about there's a nature and nurture debate. Are people born this way? Okay. Or are they made by things that happen around them? So is it nature, which is our behaviors determined by genetic inheritance, or is it nurture? Our behavior is determined by environment and experience. He was very much focused on the nurture component, that behavior is determined by the environment that we're in and the experiences that we have. Okay, so that is where, there's a very significant difference with how the behaviorists are shifted. And that's why I say to you, when we look at behaviorism, we really don't look at ourselves in isolation. We have to look at the environments in which we find ourselves. And we'll unpack a lot of these ideas and theories later on when we do a module around conditioning and learning. So it's really just for you to understand these different perspectives and how they progressed. So he did an experiment called Little Albert, in which he demonstrated that a child could be conditioned to fear something that they weren't previously scared of. But ultimately, when you think about advertising, this is where John B. Watson ended up. He ended up in advertising because he learned how you could adapt people's behavior by changing what they were exposed to. Pavlov is another fundamental theorist that comes into behaviorism. You might have heard the expression Pavlov's dog, and it's about how you can condition somebody to respond in a certain way. So it's about his process that he worked with was called classical conditioning, and ultimately what he did was he got a dog to salivate to the sound of a bell. Okay, so a dog would normally salivate when it saw a bone, but by pairing the bone and the bell together and then removing the bone, ultimately he could condition the animal to salivate in response to something that had no natural recognition to, which was a bell. So that's what Pavlov did, and you'll learn about it. But it's more about stimulus and response, that the stimulus is there's an observable event that happens in our environment, and we have a response to that. Okay, that's what causes the behavior. It's our response to a stimulus. Again, something around rewards and punishment is also key in the behaviorist approach, and trying to shape an individual to behave in a certain way. Skinner, again, we'll learn more about. He was also fundamental in the behaviorists. He had a process called operant conditioning. So again, it's about changing someone's behavior through a process of learning. And he put rats in a box, and by conditioning the rat to push a lever. Every time the rat pushed a lever, a pellet of food was released. He managed to change the behavior. Once the rat learned that the food was released every time it pushed the lever, it would push the lever more and more frequently because it was being rewarded when it pushed the lever. So that's about shaping behavior in certain ways. And he used this device that he called a Skinner box with rats in it, and it was about you can manipulate somebody by using a process of positive reinforcement with them. So you reinforce a behavior with something positive, the behavior will happen more and more frequently. So that's operant conditioning. And again, you can see how the behaviorists were starting to understand and control people's behavior. Namfundo, no, Freud is not, it's not, he doesn't fall under the South African history. Okay, the next discipline, the next sort of approach or perspective that came along were the humanists. So again, very different to behaviorists. The humanist key perspective was that humans are free, rational beings with the potential for personal growth, fundamentally different to animals. So behaviorists work with animals, the humanists worked with humans, and basically saying everybody has free will. Okay, they again weren't interested in what had happened in the past to somebody, what was repressed. They take the approach of everybody is unique. So there's no determinism about it. You're not putting somebody in a box. Everybody is unique, and they don't seek to explain behaviors. They really don't. They focus on potential for change. So the emphasis with a humanist perspective is very much around developing the concept of self and about growth. And everybody has the potential to grow and become the best person they can be. It's a process that we're trying to continually fulfill our potential. And so when we're not meeting our needs to reach our potential, okay, when there's a distortion sometimes between how we see ourselves, how we think we should be, and how we really are, that can cause mental disturbances. So kind of issues happen to us, or we develop mental disorders or anxiety, for example, is because the image we have of ourselves, our self-image is very different to how we think we should be. And there's a distortion there, and it causes sort of mental problems. So by not meeting our human needs of reaching our potential, we're all striving to reach our potential, but by not meeting those needs, we can suffer from mental disturbances. So the approach of humanists really, it's quite critical around when we come to how we deal with different psychological disorders. They have an approach called client-centered therapy, where you put the person at the middle, okay, in the middle of the situation. You listen to them, you talk to them. It's a very open environment. You allow people to develop their self-concept, very much based around active listening. And there's no such thing as bad societies. Okay, so Maslow is key here. Maslow has a process. He had a hierarchy of needs, and you might have heard of this as well. So human motivation to achieve, to become the best person we can be, to reach that pinnacle of self-actualization, you have to move through these certain stages. And the first one is your physiological needs, that the need to be fed, need to have air, the need to have water. And you can't begin to become your best self if your physiological needs are not met. Okay, so you have to start at the base of that pyramid. And once your physiological needs are met, that you've got food and air and water, you have to feel safe. Okay, so when you feel unsafe, you can't be the best person you can be. So everybody's striving to self-actualization, but they have to move through these levels first and achieve them before you can move up. A lot of the humanists are done through case studies, specifically Maslow. He looked at journals and autobiographies of people he really and truly felt had reached that pinnacle of self-actualization. and he sort of unpacked who they were and what their values were. And not many of us reach that pinnacle, okay? That true best self in any way, you know. So he really did analyze people, historical figures who he felt had reached that pinnacle point. Carl Rogers, like I explained to you, he has a significant theory of personality, which is about your self-concept, which really looks at our self-worth, our self-image, and our ideal self, and his approach of client-centered therapy to help people get to the point that they could reach their unique potential. So very much putting the person at the center of this, and not much interest in what had happened in the past, what is happening in the environment. It's all about our own self-concept. Then the cognitive psychologists came along, this perspective, and it's not by bringing in a new perspective, it's not putting the others away. They can all happen alongside each other. Sometimes there might be research that's done that dips into each different perspective. So by a new one coming along, it doesn't knock away the old one. Okay, they can work side by side, and researchers might focus on, they might be a cognitive specialist, someone else might call themselves a behaviorist, someone else might dip between the two, but it is just these different perspectives that sort of work alongside each other with different processes. So cognitive perspective really talks to those mental processes that we spoke about. It talks about our mind acquiring knowledge, and very much based around our conscious experiences. So they say that human behavior can't be fully understood without understanding how people acquire, store, and process information. So very much a relationship between what is going on in the mind, the body, and the behavior. So looking at those mental processes that are happening, and any disruption in those mental processes can lead to abnormal behavior. So they did the study, they study internal mental processes. So things like memory, decision-making, and problem solving, those mental processes we spoke about in the beginning, okay, that's what cognitive psychologists look at. So thoughts, and just the final paragraph of that little box, and I will put up these slides for you to refer to. So we had the behaviorists start with the precept that all human behavior is learned and adaptable to context and environment. The behavior can be punished and reinforced. Cognitive psychology, on the other hand, essentially assumes more agency. Thoughts and feelings are seen as more active in the process of behavior formation. So very much focus on thoughts and feelings. Individuals are perceived to process thoughts that determine if and how behaviors are to be carried out. Very much so, very much so. Cognitive thinking is applicable to today's life. And so is behaviorism, because we are very much influenced by what is happening around it, but often then it's how we think about it. So you can see it's what we call an interactionist perspective, is there's interaction between some of these different theoretical perspectives. And we see that more and more. So basically, individuals are perceived to process thoughts that determine if and how behaviors are to be carried out. So there's agency, there's choice. Okay, your thinking will tell you if that behavior is to be carried out. It's not something happening to you, it's something that you are an active person participating in. Then we have our biological approach, another one. Okay, so basically, and we unpack the biology of behavior in later modules. It's actually very interesting. So any kind of behavior or functioning is explained in terms of bodily structures and biochemical processes that underlie behavior. So internal, biological, physical, chemical, and biological processes influence behavior. So that's where we start to look at hormones, different neurotransmitters that operate in our mind, and we unpack this quite a lot. So for example, if you are stressed, there is a hormone called cortisol that is released that can increase your stress levels. So stress, people have different behavioral responses to stress, but ultimately the cause of stress, not always, and obviously environmental factors can compound stress, but there are hormones, there are neurotransmitters, there are genes that influence our behavior. You can see there's a biological component to it as well. So very much how psychological issues are impacted by biological processes. And we can see evidence of that in the treatment of some disorders. So we treat a disorder through medication. For example, someone with severe psychosis or schizophrenia, and each time we look at a mental disorder, you'll see we'll unpack the different possible causes of that disorder. Some have a significant biological cause. Others have different causes, but a lot of the times, like your disorders like schizophrenia, are caused through biology, okay, through structures in the brain, through neurotransmitters that carry signals, and we'll learn about that. So it's very much concerned with the attempt to understand human behavior from the biological perspective. So we unpack the brain in great detail. We unpack how the nervous system works. That's where it gets to be a little bit like a life science lesson for you. And the final perspective that's also included is the evolutionary perspective. Okay, so that's based on how evolution has shaped our mind and our behavior. So our behaviors that we exhibit, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, those behavior patterns evolve to solve adaptive problems, because evolution is favoring natural selection. Okay, that's what evolution is. It's trying to increase the survival of the species. Okay, that's our evolutionary tendencies, that we try to enhance reproductive success. It's all about the survival of the species, and this is how behaviors have evolved. There's an evolutionary component. So behavior, like anatomical characteristics, evolves as products of evolution. So our behavior that we exhibit enhances the ability to produce genes for the next generation. So that process you hear about of natural selection, evolutionary psychology supports that. It supports that our behaviors are trying to keep us alive, to reproduce for survival of the species, and we have adapted over time to accommodate various evolutionary events that have taken place. So evolutionary psychology proposes that the human brain comprises many functional mechanisms that they call psychological adaptations or evolved cognitive mechanisms designed by the process of natural selection. Favorable adaptations, so anything that's favorable is preferred over an unfavorable adaptation. And those adaptations are passed down through generations. For example, an adaptation could involve things as a tendency to be vigilant for potential threats, or an adaptation to work cooperatively in groups. Okay, but it's based on survival and it's a natural tendency. It even could look at mating preferences, how we choose partners that are similar to us, so that again, it's supporting the evolutionary perspective. Even how our foraging mechanisms, even our acquisition of language is all underpinned by these evolutionary tendencies. So if I put that in a little table for you like that, which you have a similar table in your book, you can see those different perspectives. There's the behavior, the psychoanalytic, like we discussed, the humanistic, we discussed, cognitive, biological, and evolutionary. Each one of those perspectives has got important contributors. We discussed Watson, Pavlov, and Skinner. Psychoanalytic, we discussed Freud, the humanist. So you can see that how they come together. Each one had a different kind of subject matter that they looked at and studied, and each one had its own basic premises. So if we had to look at those 6 contemporary, there are other perspectives that come in, but we call these the 6 contemporary theoretical perspectives. Okay, so those structuralist and functionalist schools of thought were really overtaken by these contemporary different perspectives, all trying to understand how the mind works, how mental processes work, how behavior works, in order to sort of explain why we act and think and behave the way we do. Does that make sense to you? That's sort of the history of it, and those important perspectives. You will, guys, you will need to know we're doing sit down exams, so it's important, but you'll learn them over time. And your ICE task, again, you'll very quickly come to understand that Watson and Skinner are behaviorists and Jung and Freud were psychoanalysts. So don't stress too much about the dates in this. It's not so more important. It's more about understanding the different perspectives and who the major contributors were. And again, as we work through some of the next learning units, some of these names will definitely be reinforced to you because they come up quite often. We have quite a long section on learning and behaviorism that will really make you familiar with these names. They do. All of these perspectives have a foundation in really how we understand psychology. Okay, psychology in Africa and South Africa. Guys, this is just a section of your textbook that really outlines how in South Africa psychology evolved as a discipline. It's a little bit like a history lesson. What I suggest you do, and I've put here, please read it. It's not really something I can teach you. It really is just reading. Pull out some of those key names. And then last semester when we had the exam for this module, there was a tricky question that said, name 2 of the key role players in psychology in South Africa, and you had to sort of name them. So I'm not going to unpack it now. It is just reading, and it is just having a little table that you can just pull out those key names and just orientate yourself. But generally, when we talk about the history of psychology, you can see where this came from. Most of these theorists are white. They're all from a Western background. Okay, and they were taking theories that they were applying to general populations, including ethnic minorities. But now that has changed. Okay, people are saying that we have to pay more attention to cultural, political, and socioeconomic variables. The world has basically shrunk. We've all become closer together. We've now become more interconnected than ever. And you can't just take these blanket sort of theories and apply them to everybody. So you can see that there is a section on the historical development of psychology in South Africa, which just considers acclaimed South African psychologists and research, and also pre-1994. Yes, so you've read it. Well done. Thanks, Melissa. Jan Smuts was really one of the first people to be a focus in this discipline, and it's grown, but obviously it's been curtailed by the socio-political context we found ourselves in. Back in the apartheid days, psychology was actually used as a tool to divide people, to separate people. Intelligence testing was done on different race groups, and people were being classified, but yet the intelligence test was developed for a population that it wasn't suited to test, if you understand what I'm saying. So psychology and some of the psychological research was used to further political causes. Things like social engineering, not just in South Africa, but we can see that in other parts of the world. We're using psychological tools to justify segregation and exclusion. So post-1994, obviously the discipline became more unified, and so it's really just a case of understanding it's very interesting. Other names, you can use all those names as long as they're in your, you don't have to know it in detail. I would just make yourself a table, and we don't stress about that now. We will come to that, but I'm just telling you, please read it, and when you read it, just do a nice summary of some of these important role players. Okay, and then we talk about, we've said that psychology, the dominance was Western psychology, and it is being increasingly challenged. And there is now, there has been for quite a while about movement towards more indigenous psychologies, and especially an African psychology. So an African-centered psychology that's grounded in philosophies, traditions, history, politics, religions, and social realities of us, of African people. Okay, we can't just take Western psychology and impose it. So even within African psychology, there's different ways to look at it. You've got sort of a Western orientated African psychology where behaviors are studied as Western psychology, just within an African setting. So we take the same thing and we put it in an African setting. Therefore, it's a Western orientated African psychology. We've got a cultural African psychology where we look at people's perspectives and lived realities are shaped by their culture. And culture draws heavily on cultural and spiritual concepts. Okay, so we see that a lot. Your cultural African psychology takes into account things like ancestors and the impact that ancestors can have on people's behaviors. So it's really grounding it in cultural and spiritual concepts. A critical African psychology, which is really how different social structures shape psychology, opposing that Western dominant role. And then psychological African studies, which engage with other African fields such as literature and creative work. So African psychology should be uncompromisingly African-centered and grounded in the philosophies and traditions of African people. So when we're looking at this history of psychology, please bear in mind that this is not just a blanket that is applied, that these are sort of some of the grounding theorists and perspectives, but now within countries or within continents, within cultural and racial groups, whatever it might be, there are becoming more grounded approaches that take cognizance of the environments that we find ourselves in. And psychological thinking is guided, okay, by these kinds of things. So that's sort of the end of the content, and I hope it's given you a significant overview and will make the chapter clearer to you. So at the end of the chapter, it tells you, and really this is a nice summary. So psychology is a field of study. It's empirical. We've discussed that. Knowledge must be acquired through observation, data, and documentation. Psychology is theoretically diverse. I think we've covered that many systems of interrelated ideas are used to explain something. Okay, we can't just put it in a box. Often we have to bring in different ways of thinking about things to explain. Psychology involves a socio-historical context. Social trends leave their mark, and psychology leaves its mark on society. So themes related to psychology subject matter: behavior is determined by multiple causes. Behavior is shaped by cultural heritage. Heredity and environment jointly influence behavior. And you'll see these themes continually. People's experience of the world is highly subjective. Okay, so some critical themes, but you'll see them as we move through the different modules. So if we had to come back to our definition, back and take everything we've done since the beginning, psychology is a science, we've said that studies behavior. We've looked at some of those perspectives and the physiological and cognitive processes that underlie behavior. And it's the profession that applied their cumulative knowledge of science to practical problems. So that's just a definition. This is not the definition. There are many definitions, okay, depending on how you pack it, but I'm trying to give you a definition that really encompasses what we have looked at this evening so that we can see those different terms. If you want to be psychologists, okay, there's different areas of specialization, and you'll see as we move into further years, and you know, to become a psychologist, you've got to do your undergrad, you've got to do your honors, you've got to do your masters, and then you've got to do your community internship. But you'll see, even within psychology, you have clinical psychologists who do treatment and psychological problems and disorders. You have counseling psychologists, educational psychologists, research psychologists, industrial psychologists, and you can see the field is vast. Okay, and as we unpack it more, you might find more or different areas that interest you, and a little diagram there as to where different psychologists are employed. So again, it's just a taste of where this can take you. Righty, so let me just show you now. So in your more resources folder, which I hope you've had a chance to look at, you'll see a drop down with lecture recordings. That's where I will put the recording for tonight, along with the slides. I have uploaded some additional resources for you, some videos on some of those theorists to make them clearer. I've put up information for you on different referencing and different writing sources. Your ICE task activities sit in this folder, ICE task activities, and I've also put the module outline. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a guide. This is your first ICE task, okay? It's called the History of Psychology. So when you go to your ICE task folder, you click on this little ICE task here. It's actually activities. So these are all the different activities are coming out of your learning unit that's on VC Learn, and I take one of them and I turn it into an ICE task. Okay, so you have to submit 4 ICE tasks. So there will be 4 tasks here. At the moment, there's only 2, but module 1, 2, 3, and 4 will have an ICE task in it. I've only put up the first 2 for now, so you can move on with doing this ICE task, and the next and final slide is showing you the ICE task. So the ICE task says use any application of your choice to create a document, and basically you're going to create that table, and basically those perspectives that we've just been through, those 6 different perspectives, you're going to plot them down, name them, you're going to give a little overview which will show that you've understood them, and you'll put in your important contributors. Okay, so it's quite a straightforward ICE task, but it really is about you consolidating this learning. So when describing major contribution early theorists, are we going to say, for example, you're going to say the theoretical school is humanist, the humanist perspective is this, Rogers was an important contributor. Okay, so it's just consolidating your learning. I want you to please try to use referencing. You can use any source for this, not just your textbook. If you want to do some research on your own and add some more to it, you're welcome, but I need you to make sure that you start to attempt to reference. Okay, you use APA referencing. If anybody is unsure about referencing, there's lots of referencing resources that I've put up under more resources. There are recordings of support sessions, academic writing support sessions, but please, I need you to try to reference, even if it's just referencing the textbook. It's important we get referencing right early on. Don't stress about your assignment. Your assignment is up. Your due date is up, and you can work on your assignment as you will up into the due date, but we will, before the assignment is due, we have what's called a national support session, and that's where I specifically go through the assignment with you to make sure that you're guided in how you answer those questions. So at the moment, it's still early days indeed, and we're going to finish module 1, you're going to do the ICE task, and when you're comfortable with this material, you're going to start to go through the material for the second module. And then we have our collab session sort of at the end of the session, at the end of the 2-week period, because this is where you can ask me questions that you are grappling with. Okay, and it's cement things. You use APA. It's the American Psychological Association, and you use their style of referencing. It's not much different to Harvard. It's pretty similar. If you know how to reference, it's easier just to adapt. There's a few small changes. So if you want to reference a website, and go to Google and say, how do I reference a website using APA, and it will give it to you exactly. There's resources loaded for you. Al Purdue is a very good one. I think there's a link on APA referencing, and it tells you exactly step by step how to reference a website, how to reference a journal article. You can just use the feature on Word to make your bibliography if you know how to do that. Okay, with pleasure. And if anybody's unsure, so right now we don't need to research anything. Our ask task is really based around what we've covered in this learning unit, what you can interpret from your textbook. Ask tasks and assignments are different. Ask tasks are called interactive content engagement. Okay, overall, these 4 ask tasks contribute 10% of your mark for the year. Your assignments are more significant. They count 25. You've got 2 assignments. They count 25% each of your final year mark, and they are more detailed, and they require research, and they require strong academic writing. These ask tasks are really for you to engage with content. It's to help you with your learning and understanding. So there's 4 of them. So each one of them contributes collectively 10% of your final year mark. I read somewhere that if we submit, we get an automatic 5%. You submit your ask tasks to me, and it's a place where I can give you feedback. Okay, so feedback should be important. But yes, by submitting the ask tasks, if you submit all 4, you get whatever the percentage is. So it's like 2.5% each of that 10% because you've got 5 of them. Okay, so if you submit your ask task, you basically get the mark, get the checkbox that you've submitted, and you get the 2.5%. But what you need to understand is you need to engage with your ask tasks, because this is where learning takes place. Okay, and if you give me an ask task that really has got no effort attached to it, I potentially will mark it as unsubmitted. I would like to see that there's some level of engagement and understanding with your ask tasks. Does that make sense? If you've read that somewhere. But yeah, so your ask tasks get marked. I give you a mark out of 5, which really guides, how you've done in the task, so you can really reflect. But ultimately, when it's added, you have to have submitted those 4 ask tasks to get the full 10%. That's what it is. Okay. There is a developmental activity in your activities as well. I think you've got to do that developmental activity for learning. But your ask tasks are where I can give you feedback. And if it really is completely insubstantial, then I would potentially say that it's not been submitted. Okay, it's got to have some level of effort in it. All right, everybody, I'm sorry I've gone well over the extended time, and I do apologize for keeping you. I think just being the first session and a bit more explaining, it's a bit longer. Is everyone good? Any more questions? Welcome to email me at any time. Anytime. I have a YouTube. What I do is I will share this recording. I upload it to YouTube, and I will share with you the link to the recording. My email, I'll put an announcement up with my email just to remind everybody. It is, I can put it here in the chat, but I'm not very, Wakefield at iie.ac.za. Okay, I don't have a group WhatsApp. Okay, I communicate via email with everybody. I communicate by my announcements, which keep checking your announcements. I try to keep them regular, and by email. If you would like to set up a group WhatsApp, you are absolutely more than welcome, and I'm happy to share the WhatsApp details on the announcement page for everybody so that people can join if somebody wants to do that. But my communication is via email, and if you have a representative if there's issues, you're welcome to email me directly and we can engage. But I try and WhatsApp gets very busy, and anything I want to say gets lost, but I'm always available on my emails to everybody. Okay, all good. It's fine. It's fine. Don't stress. I love older students. You bring so much experience with you. So when we have, so basically, if a brief summary is really a brief summary, it means that you don't have to know every single infinite detail. Okay, you need to be able to understand. Explain means that you need to be able to give more detail. explain something why happens, give more detail to it. 10 lines, basically when we do our national support session, and you'll see that when we talk according to marks, that basically if something is worth about 10 marks, it should be a decent sized paragraph. Okay, so if you want to briefly explain something, I'd really look at a paragraph in order to briefly explain something for whichever point it might be. Does that make sense? But you'll see that more in the assignment. You'll get to understand it. Please don't stress. You bring so much experience. Older students and people who studied many moons ago are my speciality. Yep, and we're with you. We've got patience, and all the support that you need is there for you. It really is. It really is. All right, everybody, please take care. Please stay warm. Any complex challenges, just let me know. All right, can I stop the recording?